Welcome to Café with Cavanha, oil and gas and supply chain debate channel. With me today are Dale Rogers and Zachary Rogers. Dale is professor of business at Arizona State University. Zach is professor at Colorado State University. Today, we are going to talk about supply chain trends in a worldwide vision. Good afternoon, Dale and Zach.
Good afternoon.
Hey, good morning. Afternoon.
Morning,
it's
here.
morning here.
Yeah,
It's morning in Colorado. Afternoon there, I guess.
1 p.m. here in Brazil today. Okay, let me give you the first question and problem to see your opinions. What are the news in supply chain? I mean, in terms of concepts, techniques, new things that are probably happening in supply chain.
So one of the things that I've been working on a lot recently that I really think is an emerging topic is supply chain concept of supply chain cybersecurity. So we've been looking at the way that hacks or cyber attacks happen basically since 2011 until now. And we see a really interesting pattern. So in 2011, most attacks, if you were going to try to get some company's data, you would attack that company, face on, essentially. But now, as companies realize what a threat this is, they're dedicating more and more resources. I mean, a company like Target, for example, they have a whole building of people, working on IT and making sure that their systems are secure. Yet we still see Target get hacked a couple of years ago. So how does that happen? Well, attackers identified a very small, privately held, 125-person supplier. It fixed Target's like air conditioners in the stores, and that company was not as sophisticated as Target. They had like the free version of some antivirus software, and they were able to infiltrate that company's systems, steal their credentials, get into Target's back office systems, specifically their point of sale, and steal like 110 million credit cards, my own included, by the way. So I have a personal stake in this research, and it's really an emerging technique that we see. In 2011, maybe 10%, 15% of the reported cyber attacks were coming through the supply chain. The other 80%, 85% were directly at the company. In 2017, that number was flipped. It was over 60% of all cyber attacks are now coming through suppliers. And so essentially, what attackers are realizing is that we can't attack the front of the castle anymore. It's too strong. The defenses are too good. But maybe there's a back door, which we call in our paper the supplier back door, and that's a way through. And so essentially what we see is cybersecurity moving from really just an IT, computer science, systems problem to more of a supply chain problem. Similar to maybe the way supply chain folks had to start thinking about quality 40 years ago, or about sustainability 10 years ago. I think that cybersecurity in the supply chain and making sure your suppliers and their suppliers are compliant with everything is really kind of the next frontier of supply management.
And is there a prediction for 2030, for instance?
Is there predictions for, excuse me?
2000.
Prediction for 2030?
Yeah, so I would guess that companies are going to, it'll be like, sustainability, now compared to 10 years ago. So I think there's going to, some leaders will emerge, and then you'll sort of see norms developing as it really becomes more and more important for your suppliers to be compliant with certain security protocols in order to work with you. Now, there will also probably be more vulnerabilities opening up, especially as more smart objects like Internet of Things. If every pallet is connected to the internet, to say this is how much stuff is on the pallet, now that's just another opening for attackers. So at the same time, there's sort of these two tensions of we want to connect everything, but also we have to protect everything. I think it's going to be really interesting to see where that tension ends up. 10 years
one
down
of
the road.
the potential solutions that I've been working on is blockchain. Now, I'm more skeptical probably than a lot of people are about blockchain, but because blockchain is not very efficient technology, it requires a lot of systems resources and a lot of storage. And so I think probably around 2030 is probably when blockchain will really be useful. Maybe a little before that, but it's going to be a while. And blockchain is a way to help improve your cybersecurity because you're replicating the database. Every time there's a new piece of information, it becomes a new block, and then those blocks are distributed through all of the members of the supply network. So I think that one of the answers for the cybersecurity problem in certain types of applications is probably blockchain.
And Dale and Zach, in terms of Industry 4.0, digitalization, sensors to follow movement of things, how do you see the Industry 4.0 coming to supply chain?
I think you're starting to see that already a little bit. We're actually working on the digitalization of the supply chain, and it's interesting. You and I are both not young guys, Cavanha, and Zach is a young guy, but,
yeah,
you and I are not. But I think in our careers, both your career and my career, this is the time of greatest change ever in technology and in the supply chain. We're seeing more tremendously quick changes taking place. It's one of the reasons for sort of the crazy politics of the time. You know, we've never seen the United States act as crazy as we are right now. and it's because of the discomfort, because of the incredibly fast change. It has a lot to do with us. And the fact that we moved all these countries sort of virtually closer together because of the very easy ability to exchange information.
That's right.
And so I do think that the amount of change is happening so quickly. You know, back at ASU, I have the Internet Edge Supply Chain Lab, and it's this idea that moving to processing out on the edge of the internet, away from just centralized processing. I'm going to try to make this simple to understand, but we're moving out where the internet meets people and businesses and so on, and we're going to do a lot of decentralized processing and thinking, and there's going to be a lot of automation. And if you look at what's happening, for example, with cognitive computing, so artificial intelligence, I worked on AI back in the 1980s, for Dr. Bowersox and those guys at Dialogue Systems when I was a younger guy. And AI was sort of black boxy. It wasn't that useful. It was neural networks. It was expert systems, which never realized a lot of promise. But today, AI is really advanced statistical methods. And those advanced, and they're not new statistical methods, it's just we've got greater power to do the processing. And that's putting a lot of ability to automate all sorts of processes. And we're making decisions remotely that we used to not be able to make with lots of people. And so we're part of this digitization, this industry 4.0 is this movement towards automating a lot of processes that used to require thousands of people maybe to do, but with large data sets, and Zach and I have a thing going on big data, research project on big data, with large data sets and greater processing power, and applying AI, which truly these days is the statistical method. Some that you learned a long time ago in school, like Bayesian methods and so on, that's now an artificial intelligence method.
Yeah.
and you're able to do a lot of things quickly with fewer resources, and that's going to change really almost everything how we do business. Just the move to e-commerce. Zachary's mother and I drove up to Colorado the last couple of days from Arizona to come see Zach and his family. And on the way yesterday, we stopped at one of those big outlet malls that we've had in the U.S. for several years. And like many of the brick and mortar retail malls in the United States, there were hardly any stores left in this outlet mall. One of the guys that was working at one of the stores we stopped at said, well, the mall has been repossessed by the bank. There's hardly any tenants left. We're hoping that we'll get an owner and revitalize the thing. But if you go back a couple of years, maybe 3 or 4 years, we had 1,200 shopping malls in the United States. We're headed to about 700. A lot of this is due to the increase in e-commerce, which is part of this digitization of the supply chain. And effects, both positive and negative, have been just huge. And again, it is part of the reason why the politics in the U.S. and some other places have just gotten crazy.
The other piece of that, in terms of supply chain networks, so one of the other projects we work on, so every couple of months we send out a report called the Logistics Managers Index. And it's a change index, and we measure the growth in transportation prices, transportation capacity, warehouse prices, warehouse capacity, and then inventory levels. And the last few readings, the last few periods, the increase in transportation price has been straight up. I mean, transportation price going through the roof right now, and capacity is going in the other direction, essentially. So not that there's less trucks, but just that the demand for point-to-point delivery, for last-mile delivery, is so far outstripping supply that it's really, really stressing supply network. And it's difficult for companies because to build a fleet of trucks is a big capital investment. And we're at kind of a funny place right now because I think that nobody wants to be the ones who build the last really expensive trucks that can't drive themselves. And so we're they're still building trucks, but not nearly at the rate that we do right now. And it's the math problem that e-commerce is. So I used to work in an e-commerce fulfillment before I came back to school. And I always tell my students, in our distribution center, you're putting pallets on a truck to send to one store. At my building, we were putting 4,000 boxes on 5 different trucks and sending them to 4,000 different houses. That's a much, much more complicated problem, right? And so it's driven by this I think Industry 4.0, and it's really stressing the resources of, I guess, what you would call Industry 3.0. So the infrastructure of this sort of former iteration of business cannot keep up.
The point, Zach, and the concepts of supply chain that support supply chain are not changing too much. The technology is changing a lot and are forcing concepts to adapt some kind of centralization of storage and things like that, and different jobs, not in retail, but in the center of distribution center. I'd
push back just a little bit on that, because I think some key concepts have changed. And that's the concept of economies of scale and distance. So it used to be when you're setting up a distribution network that you would put, okay, maybe, we'll have one warehouse for the East Coast, one for the West Coast, one for the South, one for the Midwest, and that's it. Because it's cheaper on a per unit basis if trucks have to drive farther. And, if it doesn't get there for 5 days, that's not a big deal. Who cares about that? Now, one of the main things that companies are competing on is service and delivery time. So, for example, they're right now, right down the road from me, they're building a brand new Amazon warehouse. And it's in a sort of northern suburb of Denver, and it's right on the main interstate. Now, 10 years ago, Amazon would have never built a warehouse right there because it's really expensive real estate. The taxes in Colorado, it's a nexus tax state, so you get taxed twice on stuff. They would never have built it there 10 years ago under the old kind of models. But today, what they care about more than the cost of that warehouse is that they can have next day or same day delivery into Denver because there's 2 million people there. And so now Amazon, I think it's something like there's a fulfillment center within 20 miles of like 35% of the population in the United States. And that's a market shift, I think, from the way that these networks, distribution networks used to work, where it was all about distance and making the loads as cheap as possible. And now it's all about speed and
you know, it is funny how it has changed. So Cavanha, we spent, you know, in the U.S. and I think also in Brazil, a lot of the last 30 years, reducing the number of distribution centers from many to fewer because of the square root law that says you want to minimize inventory. Certainly in the U.S., transportation has been cheap. Inventory has been expensive. It was part of the idea of getting inventory out of the system. So you centralize, consolidate distribution centers. And just in the last few years, primarily because of this digitization and the move to e-commerce, the conventional wisdom has changed. And you know, it used to be, we would say, okay, there's like 4 distribution center cities that you want to locate in. Maybe somewhere in Atlanta, Eastern Pennsylvania, so you serve New York and New Jersey. You know, another one in central U.S., Indianapolis or Columbus, and then maybe one on the West Coast, like in Reno, where we used to live, or the Inland Empire in Southern California, and you could service the whole country in a couple of days from those 4, and you make them very big.
Yeah.
Now you've got to get stuff in the same day. And, you know, I just heard about Amazon putting a 1 million square foot facility, maybe it's 2 million, right at, on the New Jersey Turnpike, right by where I used to live when I taught at Rutgers. Exit 8 on the New Jersey Turnpike. 1 million square foot, no one 5 years ago would have put a 1 million square foot facility in New Jersey. You know, it just wouldn't, I mean, that wouldn't have been rational. But because time is so much of the essence, and you know, truthfully, a large warehouse is less expensive than a big box retail store in the same spot. And so those big box retail stores are going to disappear in the same area, and you're going to see distribution show up.
This is a very good point, delivery time. But is China a point of transformation, forcing transformation in the US? I mean, can you bring goods and services from China in a good delivery time, or must be in the US, the storage, distribution centers?
Well, we've spent the last 25 years bringing stuff in from China. And there's a couple of things going on. One, the politics of that has really hit sort of an inflection point about 4 or 5 years ago. People are really nervous about, you know, particularly like folks from where I come from. So I grew up in Michigan, as you know, and everybody in my neighborhood, their parents worked in the auto industry, and a lot of those jobs have disappeared, more due to robotics and so on than because of China. But we can't really blame robots, so we're blaming China. You know, it was the same thing going back nearly 40 years about Japan and the car industry. We blamed Japan, and really it was just the US car industry wasn't very efficient. We learned a lot of stuff from the Japanese. We implemented those methods. It was better for a while. But there's this feeling in a lot of the US that the good jobs have all moved outside the US and mostly to China. And there is certainly some truth to that. You know, it's way easier to manage a Chinese factory via a contract than a very difficult unionized labor force in the U.S. You know, it's interesting. Our buddy Cesar always would say to me, "Well, Dale, it's not going to happen in Brazil because we have our own China up in the north." I don't know that that's so true. You know, one of the things you certainly see in Brazil is a new emphasis on international trade compared to what it used to have. You know, you think about Brazil and the international trade. I remember the first time I went to the Port of Santos, and I thought, "You're kidding! This is the main port. This is terrible." That's what I mean. That was an American perspective, but Brazil had always been very autonomous, and it's pretty clear that Brazil is not going to be autonomous in the future. China has become a very important trading partner, and the role of China in the globe is changing. You know, I don't know if you guys are watching this One Belt, One Road initiative that China has, which is really a logistics initiative, but it's a brilliant thing that they're doing, because the costs in China are becoming too high. You know, the labor costs, you know, they're moving from third world very quickly to be first world and maybe be the most advanced country in the world. You know, you think about, I don't know when the last time you were in China, Cavanha is, but, you know, you go back 10 years, you couldn't use a credit card in China.
Yeah.
Well, now, you mostly don't use a credit card because they've leapfrogged all that, and you use your phone. And the U.S. isn't using their phone mostly to pay. I mean, I have an Apple Watch, and so I like places that have it. I'll put it on the thing and so on. But China has very quickly, in less than 10 years, really leapfrogged. Well, this One Belt, One Road thing is them trying to be sort of the 4PL of the globe, and managing all of these logistics flows, because they know their costs are too high. They know their costs have gotten too high, and so they're both planning to expand from a market perspective to some of these places that haven't been served well: Pakistan, Iraq, Iran, all those places that are included in the One Belt, One Road. It's sort of bringing back the old Silk Road idea, but also having those be suppliers, and they will be the manager of that whole supply base. And it's brilliant, and the U.S. probably should have done something like that.
And Zach, coming back to the issue of cybersecurity, in terms of China, combine these two matters, China and cybersecurity. What do you have in terms of China and cybersecurity? Is there something special?
So with China, honestly, I mean, most of the attacks that we measure, some do come from China. Most of them seem to be Eastern European that we see. Now, in terms of getting Chinese suppliers,
maybe the Chinese are just good.
Yeah, they might. Yeah, we just can't catch them. So in terms of getting Chinese suppliers to comply with certain cybersecurity regulations, I think that is something that could be worked out on a supplier to supplier basis. Probably. I mean, they've complied with other things, so I think we could get them to comply with this as well. The thing that's tough with China is that in some ways we don't see the same level of cyber espionage, and I think that's partly because in terms of trade or technical secrets, they can just require you to turn those over. So if you're going to work with a Chinese supplier, the government might say, well, you need to tell us how it is to make whatever it is you're making, or else you can't have our cheap factory. And so in some ways, I think it's, it's not the same level of an issue with China, because they don't have to steal it from them. We just give it to them, basically. Now, I do think that one of the things that you really see in the U.S. politically is pushing back against the theft of IP and how do we lock that down. And ironically, that's one of the things that the Trump team most wants to do. But their greatest tool to figure out the IP thing would have been joining the Pacific Free Trade Partnership, the TPP. And they pulled out of that because that would have, the TPP had levers in there to prevent the theft of intellectual property through something called the ISDS, Investor State Dispute System, that essentially would have prevented any intellectual property theft. And if we would have had, you know, all of those 11 countries representing whatever it was, 40% of global GDP, and then you bring that into a negotiation with China, I think maybe we could have made some headway. But ironically, the administration that most wants to crack down on China kind of gave away their biggest possible tool right at the beginning.
And what do you observe in terms of Brazil's supply chain and the evolution we have in South America? Do you have some information about that?
Yeah, well, you know, one of my favorite titles is I'm in supply chain finance, sustainability, and reverse logistics for ELOS, which you know, is our friends over in Rio. And so I pay attention very closely to Brazil, and I think as we alluded to before, I think we're seeing global trade, international trade play a bigger role in Brazil. I think that Brazil is still seen as one of the more difficult closed markets to deal with, and you know, one of the things when I'm teaching, I talk about in class, you know, we're talking about tariffs on goods from China and so on, and I said, if you want to see the results of a closed economy from certainly a supply chain perspective, look at Brazil. Brazil should have a much larger GDP than it does. It should have a much more successful economy than it does. And because it's so closed and the cost of moving goods in and out of there are so high, really the people of Brazil are punished for this. And until Brazil changes that and opens up, you know, the country a little bit more, it will always punish its people. You know, that the idea of a closed economy really doesn't work. Think about this, Cavanha. What's the best example of a economy that was very closed and then became very open? Because we have some examples of that. You can look at some of the Eastern European countries, Estonia, Hungary, and so on. They're much better off than they were 50 years ago. But the greatest example of this is probably China. China was very, very closed. It was closed culturally in all ways. And then they became much more open, and and of course it's a giant place. Look at the growth there. And if you compare the two really large populations in the world,
Romania, Poland,
yeah, what's the real difference? The difference is that China became global and India did not.
Yeah, that's right.
And the logic of the Brazilian policymakers that have decided, look, we can't do without this revenue we get from tariffs and so on. It's going to punish the Brazilian people as long as that's in place. There's a great book, and I'm trying to remember the name of it. It's about U.S. Trade policy that I've been reading lately. It's by a professor at Dartmouth. I'll think of it in a second, but it really goes through U.S. trade policies from before the Revolutionary War and up till the present time. And you can really see when our policies were more open and less tariffs, the country thrived, and when it was more closed, it didn't. The problem is that it's hard for people in Michigan or Wisconsin or Sao Paulo or Ministeri. Yeah, Clashing Over Commerce, A History of U.S. Trade Policy. It's a great book by Doug Irwin from.
You have the cover? Can you show the cover for me?
I don't have it with me. It's Clashing Over Commerce, A History of U.S. Trade Policy.
Oh, interesting.
At any rate, it's a great it's a great book that really shows all of the effects of different types of trade policy. So from a supply chain perspective, I think Brazil's greatest problem, because look at everything Brazil has. It has great resources. You know, I'm very familiar with the education in Brazil, and at the university level for sure, we have a first-class education.
Yeah,
the people in Brazil work really hard and are very innovative and resourceful, but the government policies, you have to say, yeah. And the ironic thing is, it feels to both, I think, Zach and I, that the U.S. is headed more in the direction of Brazil than staying what we were, which is great.
Are you coming to Brazil every year as the best or no?
Yeah, I still come to Brazil every year, but the last few years have been tough, really, because of the economy and all the corruption in the government and the crazy stuff. And you know, what's the old saying? Brazil is always the country of the future. So
you must come again to bring 2 mugs, one for Zach and one for you.
Okay, well, I'll be there. I'll be at the forum in September.
Excellent, excellent. 20th. Nice conversation. Thank you very, very much for this nice conversation.
Well, it's great to see you. I'm glad you're doing this. Thanks for inviting us. A lot of fun. And anytime you need a couple of Americans to talk, we'll be happy to do it.
Thank you. Cavanha.café with Brasil Energia Petroleum Magazine. Thank you very much.